With the spread of communism under Mao and Russia's expansion into the Eastern Bloc, the champions of democracy turned a nervous eye on Asia. When the pro-Western nation of South Korea was threatened with communist overthrow, America felt that it had no choice but to step in. America's paranoia suddenly takes a turn toward reality when in 1950, a Soviet-backed army of 90,000 North Korean communists invades South Korea. Troops are quickly deployed under the banner of the United Nations. And at their head is the great Caesar of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur. After 4 months of fighting, the strategic landing at Incheon cuts off the advancing North Korean army, and the Allies recapture the capital of Seoul. South Korean leader Syngman Rhee announces his intention to take the North entirely, uniting the peninsula under Southern control. MacArthur is in total agreement, and counter to the UN policy of containing the North Korean aggression, he pushes past the 38th parallel into North Korea. Responding to the UN presence in the North, the Communist Chinese Army swarms over the Allies with 1 million troops. As MacArthur reports to the president, "We now face an entirely new war." The 38th parallel proves to be MacArthur's Rubicon. By crossing it, he is committed to win a war that his government wants him to merely contain. Frustrated by President Truman's moderate policy against the Chinese and by a UN bid to negotiate a peaceful compromise, MacArthur orders his troops to fight on, giving Truman no alternative but to relieve him of command. For most Americans, he's still a hero, a relic of a bygone era of clear-cut objectives now lost in Cold War politics and the new policy of containment. July 27, 1953, an armistice is signed, and the Korean conflict ends in futility. Nothing is gained, and the two sides continue a nervous face-off across the 38th parallel. May 1960, Adolph Eichmann, a former Nazi living in Buenos Aires, Argentina, is found by Israeli Nazi hunters and brought back to Jerusalem. In a replay of the trials at Nuremberg, Eichmann is charged with orchestrating the transportation of millions of Jews, Gypsies, and Slavics to their deaths in concentration camps. Like those before him, Adolf Eichmann is found guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity. On May 29, 1962, he is sentenced to hang. The 1960 presidential elections were a turning point in American politics. Like no other time before, television played a large role in determining the outcome of the elections, and the spotlight belonged to the first made-for-television president, Jack Kennedy. In the 1960 presidential elections, Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon runs on the Republican ticket against the charismatic young Jack Kennedy.
That Vice President Richard M. Nixon has been unanimously nominated to be the candidate of the Republican Party for the office of President of the United States.
Near the end of the long campaign trail, the two candidates are neck and neck. But two quirks of fate work against Nixon. The first is a little joke Dwight Eisenhower makes when a reporter asks him what important decisions Nixon has been involved in during his presidency. Ike's response, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." Ordinarily, this wouldn't be the sort of thing to compromise a candidate's chances, but Nixon and Kennedy are agonizingly close in the polls. At this point, neither candidate can afford to look bad. Unfortunately for Nixon, another major blow comes when he and Jack Kennedy square off for a nationally televised debate seen by 70 million people. Nixon is still recovering from an illness, and sports a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow over gaunt and pasty skin. But Kennedy is full of the vigor and charisma of youth, a politician born for the television age.
And great challenges. If we're going to successfully move through the 60s, if we're going to be true to our destiny of being the great defender of freedom in these dangerous times, then the United States must build its strength. We are a great country.
Before the debate even begins, the television has cast Kennedy as the handsome prince and Nixon as the dark villain.
Peace demands. We will keep America the strongest nation in the world, and we will couple that strength with firm diplomacy. No apologies, no regrets. Always willing to negotiate for peace, but never conceding anything without getting a concession in return.
That November, Kennedy wins the election by the narrowest margin ever recorded, 119,450 votes. In 1958, the American-supported leader of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, is ousted by a rebel army led by Fidel Castro. Castro visits Washington, D.C. to assure the United States that he is not a communist. But America's worries are only allayed for a short time. Castro soon betrays the cause of his rebel army and installs himself as dictator at the head of a ruthless socialist state. It's at this point that Castro's former soldiers, now in exile, turn to the American CIA for assistance. An invasion plan is drawn up during the Eisenhower administration, but it's not until Kennedy is in office that the final approval is given. Kennedy okays the invasion, but fearing Soviet reprisals in Berlin, he adds the condition that no American troops be deployed. He will arm the rebels and provide air support, but after that, they're on their own. Relying on old surveillance photos and ignoring the Cuban rebels' protests, the site the CIA picks for the landing is the Bay of Pigs. The CIA leases 6 ships and sends the 1,400 ill-equipped rebels to meet the far superior Cuban army, minus the promised air support. It's a bungled effort that Castro quickly puts down. Already aware of the secret invasion plan, the media publicizes the utter failure of the U.S.-backed coup, dealing Kennedy's golden image a serious blow. The Soviet Union seizes on the American aggression at the Bay of Pigs as a pretext to arm Cuba with Soviet weapons. The United States can do little to contest this until U-2 spy planes show evidence of a medium-range Soviet missile base under construction in Cuba. Now, American embarrassment turns to outrage.
Mr. President, I am submitting today a resolution to the Security Council designed to find a way out of this calamitous situation. This resolution calls, as an interim measure under Article 40 of the Charter, for the immediate dismantling and withdrawal from Cuba of all missile and other offensive weapons.
The embattled Kennedy is in a difficult corner. He must force the removal of the missile bases while delicately averting a war with the Soviet Union.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Since there are no missiles on the launch pads yet, Kennedy hopes that this blockade will keep the Soviets from delivering them. Although he calls it a quarantine, he knows that the Soviets may consider it an act of war. In an address to his nation, Kennedy outlines the threat of a nuclear base in Cuba and the looming threat of a nuclear war.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
As Soviet merchant ships approach the quarantine line, American submarines take up positions along the Soviet coast, preparing for an attack. The Cuban army prepares for an invasion. And Kennedy puts the Air Force at DEFCON 2, one step away from a state of war. With the missile-laden Russian merchant ships drawing fearfully close, the world holds its breath. Finally, Moscow announces that they will dismantle the missile base, and both sides breathe a sigh of relief. The Russian ships turn back, and after 13 tense days, the Cuban Missile Crisis is over.